And hello to everybody watching, whether you're joining us from our WKYC website or WKYC app on YouTube or on Facebook. Thank you all for joining us here at the 9th Annual Human Trafficking Awareness Forum. I'm investigative reporter here at WKYC, Marisa Saenz. This year, I'm filling in for our Monica Robbins, who is recovering at home. Monica, if you're watching, we wish you well, and we love you. I'd like to introduce all of you to our panelists who are joining us here. We've got 6 wonderful people who have a lot of knowledge about human trafficking. First up, we're going to talk to Kirsty Muncie, who is president and CEO at the Collaborative to End Human Trafficking. Kirsty, you want to wave to us so everybody kind of knows who you are? There we go. We have Alicia Lay with the Collaborative as well. Lay is a survivor of human trafficking herself. Thank you so much for being here today with us. We also have Detective John Morgan, who played a role in pioneering the Cuyahoga Regional Trafficking Task Force, consisting of local, state, and federal agencies. Welcome, Detective. We also have Dr. Martina Moore, who is the president and CEO of Moore Counseling and Mediation Services, also a professor at John Carroll University, amongst many other titles. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Also joining us is Gulnar Farasta, the director of programs at the LGBTQ Center of Greater Cleveland. And last but certainly not least, Karen McHenry, the director of the Homeless and Missing Youth Programs at Belfair JCB. Now, first, we're going to start with Kirsty. You can go ahead. I think you've already unmuted yourself. You know, you work alongside, obviously, with the Collaborative. Kirsty has some executive experience at the Cleveland Rape Crisis Center and has been recognized by the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Kirsty, I want to ask you first, let's talk about human trafficking. And while we kick this off, we really just want to know what it is, what it actually is. Can you break that down for us?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for having us tonight and taking on this important topic of human trafficking, especially during Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So human trafficking in its essence is a crime that is all about the exploitation of human beings for profit. There is sex trafficking, there's labor trafficking, and there could be a combination of both. The crime of trafficking occurs in adults anytime someone over the age of 18 is compelled to commit a commercial sex act through force, fraud, or coercion. But for minors, it's a little bit different. For children under the age of 18, the mere involvement in the sex trade is sufficient to constitute human trafficking. And commercial sex act is defined very broadly. It's the exchange of sex for anything of value. It does not necessarily have to be money. It could be food or shelter. Labor trafficking is also the exploitation of a person. Again, that is for labor or services through, again, the use of force, fraud, or coercion. We know that although anyone can be a victim of human trafficking, we know that traffickers often prey on individuals with vulnerabilities, such as prior trauma, unsafe living situations, or homelessness. And these victims are often deceived by false promises. They're looking for love, they're promised love. They are maybe looking for a job, a stable living environment, and traffickers often promise that and then indeed lure them into situations where they're forced into these kind of services. So in a nutshell, that's really what trafficking is all about.
Okay, let's talk about, we hear it, we may not always see it for one reason or another, which is why we're having this, so we can really educate the public and those who are watching. But let's talk about the numbers here, because I think oftentimes people don't realize the scale in which it's happening. Let's break that down and where this stands for Northeast Ohio.
Yeah, numbers can be tricky when it comes to human trafficking. We don't have great data, but we're making a lot of progress in that area. So the best prevalence study that we have is from the University of Cincinnati. And in 2019, there were 1,032 victims identified in Ohio, and over 4,000 more were vulnerable. So those are some numbers that we do have, but what we know, and our experts will affirm that, is that due to the lack of centralized data mechanism and the sheer misidentifications of victims of trafficking, we believe that these numbers are very, very low and don't really show the full picture.
Real quick, could you kind of explain the grade in which, and we'll break this down with the detective who's joining us as well, that Ohio has recently received? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so the Ohio recently received an F on our state report card from Shared Hope International. Shared Hope International has given out these report cards since 2011 to really help states identify the areas in which they really need to work harder to assist trafficking victims. It's usually looked through the lens of the law because laws really guide the work around sex trafficking in the United States. And so we got an F because there are a couple things. One, the guidelines were changed. The Shared Hope has really started to look at the experience of victims and survivors more so than the criminal justice process. So that's sort of given us a little bit less of a good grade. And then they really shifted to look at service delivery, coordination of services, and all those kind of things. So the way I look at this report, while it's sort of shocking that it's a failing grade, it's really a flashlight that shows us what we can do better. And there's a lot of things that have been happening, but also a lot of things that can be done better.
All right, Kirsty, thank you so much. We're going to move on now to our next panelist, Alicia Lai, a human trafficking survivor herself. Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. You work in speaking with Kirsty, she told me that, you work obviously with the collaborative, but you really work to bring survivors together and allies together to provide solutions to end human trafficking. And before we kind of pivot to that, I want to ask you about your experience yourself. Tell our viewers and those who are watching, how did this begin for you? Do you remember anything seeming off, or did you at all understand what was happening whenever that journey started for you?
Yeah, so it began for me with childhood sexual abuse, like a lot of other survivors of human trafficking. That is a very, very common vulnerability and theme. Now, I was a teenager, so when my trafficking began, I was 14 years old. So 23 years ago, we didn't have this verbiage. So the modern anti-trafficking movement, we would say, really started around the year 2000 when we started to see a lot of these laws on the books. So we didn't have the common vernacular. And even now, victims don't have the common vernacular, even to really understand what is happening to them. So that's still part of our education and awareness. But definitely by the time I was a teenager, I realized my life wasn't as normal as some friends around me. And, very common, mine was a family controlled trafficking situation. So I was trafficked by a family member who created pornographic photos, pornographic videos, and then sold me in and out of middle-class residential homes and hotel rooms.
Okay, so you just kind of mentioned that you realized at one point your life and your childhood and your teenagers were not the same. I want to ask, and this kind of folds right into my next question for you, the indicators. Did anybody around you notice or pick up on the signs that you were part of the human trafficking scheme? And let's talk about what some of those indicators are and how what people should look for, rather.
Yeah, so for me personally, again, because at the time of my trafficking, that was not common vernacular. I was removed from my home and placed in foster care. Later on, I realized I had a lot of teachers that had called children's services. There were definitely some warning signs surrounding my life, but I didn't see that until later on. The indicators in my own life and really being, honestly, self-educating myself of my own vulnerabilities that existed and how those were exploited, which again is a common thing that survivors go through kind of retroactively. Indicators you mentioned, more and more, I think in our modern movement, we're getting away from just a list of like red flags. These are the things that you need to know. I think the reality of that is if I'm a healthcare professional versus a law enforcement professional versus a teacher, those indicators are going to look very different. As well as, we've kind of focused on the street level, pimp controlled trafficking. And now what we know is that there are over 25 different typologies of trafficking. And if you are being trafficked out of an illicit massage business, versus being trafficked in a residential area like I was, versus being trafficked via webcam or in a strip club. there are really different cultures and different terminologies for each typology. And so it's a very nuanced, it's a very nuanced, complex issue and that's why we're so passionate about education and awareness.
All right, Alicia, thank you so much. We'll move now to another one of our panelists, Detective John Morgan. Thank you for being here, Detective Morgan. Now, we know that you now work more regionally, but have also served as an FBI special agent for the Regional Trafficking Task Force, and now really focusing on helping community members learn how to spot human trafficking. I want to ask you, let's talk about this grade that Kirsty mentioned at the beginning. You've pioneered task forces, you've done a lot of work, you've helped rescue a lot of people, a lot of survivors. Talk about the work that can be done and what more needs to happen so we can steer away from this F that we've received.
Well, let's first talk about this this grade just a little bit, if I may. To put it in perspective, Shared Hope International is based out of Washington, D.C., and it's in itself, or not Washington, D.C., but Washington State. But Washington State in itself received a D. I think there's only one state in the union that actually received a C, and that was Florida. And it's kind of astonishing since we kind of have a congressman that's under investigation for juvenile sex trafficking in that state. But with that being said, I think there's only 10 states that receive Ds, and the rest of the union, 1 C, and the rest are Fs. So that tells us where we all need to improve. It isn't just the state of Ohio, we all need to improve. But what we focus on from my perspective in law enforcement isn't the grade. Our focus is the victims. And what I think a lot of people don't understand, especially when you're dealing with juvenile victims, you're dealing with victims where it's already difficult because they're not adults, they're kids. So we have to go through some sort of, whether it's Children and Family Services or some sort of a ward of the state. And so what we have problems with is we're having problems differentiating between criminals and victims. And sometimes they are intertwined because if you think about it, these traffickers know and understand that, they are in control of this juvenile, and they know that an adult who commits crimes is going to be punished much more severely than the juvenile who commits crimes. So they will utilize these juveniles to do carjackings, to do thefts, to do robberies, to do all types of things. And you don't know what is truly going on with these victims until we understand the trauma that's been had by this victim prior to the trafficking, the exploitation, and through the exploitation, if they disclose it to you. Because part of the biggest problem is trying to get them to disclose it to us that has happened to them. Because let's look at it. Every adult in their life have either exploited them or brought some sort of trauma to their life. And so therefore, instead of incarcerating these people, these juveniles in a prison, we need wraparound services. We need other things that we are able to help them and not punish them.
Can we just adjust that real quick? Okay. So navigating that is touchy, obviously, and we've got professionals like yourself who are doing so. But so for somebody who's watching, a viewer who may notice something, is it best for them to try and approach that situation themselves? How should they go about that? And what do you think they need to really keep in the back of their mind for such a fragile situation?
I always like to, everybody is so, afraid to call anyone nowadays. They don't want to get involved. They walk around with blinders on in our society, and they always say it's none of my business, right? We can use, let's say, Lorraine Avenue, for example. People drive up and down the street, Lorraine Avenue, and they see people out there. That is one of our street tracks in the city of Cleveland. And if you drive up and down Lorraine Avenue and you notice someone out there, they're not out there waiting for a bus at 2:00 in the morning or at 10 o'clock. There's no bus stop around. They're dressed, scantily, and it's 2 degrees outside. Do you think those people really want to be out there doing that? Yet, that's a highly traveled an avenue, highly traveled, and we never get any phone calls about that. The easiest way is just make a call. You know, the old term was just drop a dime. Make a call to someone. It doesn't, you can remain anonymous. You don't necessarily have to give your name. All it does is just call 443-6085 and say, I have a tip on a suspected human trafficking situation, and that's all you really need to do. You don't have to leave your name. You can just leave us a tip, detailed if there's license plates, if there's anything that you can see or that you can think of, give us a physical description, something that when we go out there, we know what to look for.
Thank you so much, Detective. I appreciate those words, and we'll be sure to share that tip line information, after, even when this forum is over, so people can look that up for sure. I want to move now on to Dr. Martina Moore, a very long, accomplished resume. Thanks so much for being here with us today. One of the accomplishments on your resume is that you've worked with the Cleveland Municipal Court Judge Marilyn B. Cassidy to develop the first human trafficking court docket. I'm going to kind of flip my line of questions that I originally had for you, because just based on what Detective Morgan said, when we talk to survivors, it's almost always obviously never a life that they choose. But how can they be treated as criminals or as perpetrators when working with survivors? How often do you see that, and why do you think that happens?
Well, we see this often in the role of the specialized docket, and our role is really to intervene and educate people about human trafficking. Many of the victims have a long history of legal offense, including things like soliciting, drugs, shoplifting, theft, domestic violence, you name it. And when we come across a victim, we immediately see red flags when we see this rap sheet of all these offenses, and we see them in the state that they're in. But if you're not trained to identify and know that, then you can't just look at the legal offenses and really zone in on those. So as a part of the human trafficking docket, that's one of the things that we do well, is when we see that, we say, oh, wait a minute, we need to go in and screen for human trafficking right away and try to identify if this is a victim. And so what we do is we do that from the very beginning, and not just looking at all of the offenses, but looking at what those offenses are telling us, because it tells us there's a lot of trauma here. And there's something behind this that we need to dig a little deeper and find out what's going on. Once we do that, one of our biggest challenges, though, is getting the victim to even understand that they are being human trafficked. And that's one of the biggest pieces to this, is working to educate the victim and those within the legal system who are looking at all of these offenses and looking at them as though maybe they're a criminal, they're not going to change. And yes, they have done some criminal activities, but much of it is a result of them being trafficked. And much of it is a result of them even being in denial about their victimization.
Okay, and I'm sure that, that goes right into my next question about life after rescue or realization, because that is obviously the first step in even realizing, coming out of shock or coming out of trauma. So really paint a picture for us of what treatment for a victim of sex trafficking is like, and the emotional and physical challenges that really come with that, because it's not easy. I can imagine it's very complex.
It is extremely complex, and even working with them is extremely complex. And so the first thing that we do is we first identify, is this a potential victim? We do a screening tool called the Vera that helps us to identify that. And just because we do that screening tool, it doesn't mean that person's going to jump on board and say, hey, I'm a victim. Many times the first thing they say is, no, I'm not a victim. I chose this myself. This is my body. I made these decisions. This is what I want to do. So we have to walk slowly with them, begin to break down the denial, and begin to educate them about their victimization. And we do that, and we begin to collaborate with them. But what we first begin to do is work on their trauma. And so we don't just sit there and say, okay, you're a human trafficking victim. What we do is we look at all the trauma that's in place and say, okay, let's start working on this. Let's take step by step and really getting a history of their trauma, breaking down the trauma and looking at ways that we can begin to intervene. Along with the trauma, we always find things like substance use disorders and other co-occurring disorders, such as depression and or anxiety. So we begin to treat those. We also look at any medical conditions that they may have, which is very difficult for the victims, because many of them, they don't want to look at their medical conditions. They don't want to go to a gynecologist. They don't want to go talk to the psychiatrist. And so it's our job to really begin to build a rapport with them, that we come alongside them as they take these huge steps to really get the help that they need. And then the largest piece is that we begin to meet their basic needs. Because if we cannot meet their basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, transportation, many of them have lost custody of their children. Many of them no longer have relationships with their family members. So we have to also put all of that in place. So the treatment plans for these individuals are very extensive. Our average treatment is anywhere from 18 months to 2 years, just to paint a picture of how long that process takes, and even longer. And it's a slow process. And it's really those of us that are treatment providers slowing down, building the rapport, and really working through the many layers that are there, so that they can trust us and just understand that we're really there to assist them in a holistic way.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Moore. I appreciate that. All right, moving now on to Gulnar Farasta. Thank you so much for being with us here today. I understand that you work closely with the LGBTQ community, and you're here to shed some light on how that the members of that community are really at risk. We'll get to that in a second, but I want to really ask you, there's often a misconception about human trafficking and choice. We've talked about that. We've heard about that some here. And people question why victims can't just get out of a situation, relating it to prostitution sometimes. So can you explain to us the difference between human trafficking and prostitution?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you for having me. I would say that, first of all, can we use a different term and call it sex work? Because that's what it is. And prostitution just has so much stigma attached to it, but there are various reasons that people might engage in sex work. I would say the core difference, going back to what Christy shared and Detective John shared, was coercion. It is a power, it's a relationship that's based on power. So when folks are being trafficked, their inherent autonomy, their right to make decisions about what they want to engage with or not engage with, are taken away. Whereas when you are engaged in sex work, it's based on consent. It's a consensual, contractual relationship between two consenting adults. I think that what ends up happening is sometimes we only look at trafficking through the lens of sex, but there's also, I've noticed that this whole conversation, we've solely talked mostly about sex trafficking, but there is also labor trafficking. And both of these show up at the intersection of queer identity and queer lived experience here in Cleveland. But that's the key difference between those two.
Okay, thank you. Let's fold right into that. What's been discovered, in talking with Kirsty leading up to this forum, she says that there's been a lot of discovery about the LGBTQ community and how they are at risk just within the last year. Talk to us about that. What has been discovered, and what's the gravity of all of the discovery here?
So I would say that I think that it's not necessarily newly discovered, but this information and this experience has always been there, but people are now paying more attention to it and are becoming more aware. I would say that the vulnerabilities, when you think about it, what makes queer individuals more vulnerable to being trafficked or being in any sort of relationship where they can be coerced and power can be used over them, would be the lack of support, the lack of social, emotional support that there is. When we look specifically at youth, because that's been a lot of attention's been paid to that. When you look at the homeless youth population, right? Close to 40% of youth that are homeless in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County are LGBTQ identifying. That's problematic. It's more problematic that we don't have LGBTQ specific youth emergency shelters, not just for youth, but also adults, for anybody in the LGBT community. And so when folks are going to the regular shelters, they're getting assaulted, they're getting abused. So when you think about it, when you have folks that are at such high risk, inevitably, they're going to have interaction with multiple systems. And all of those systems are going to end up further victimizing them because of lack of support, lack of understanding, lack of affirmation. And so when you're already marginalized, you are being victimized when you go to school. There's a lot of physical, verbal, social, emotional violence perpetrated against you. You're in a home that is unaffirming and unaccepting. So you end up out on the street. And on the street, you would participate in the informal street economies, but you're also engaging then often in survival sex, exchanging sex to meet your basic needs, which then further makes you vulnerable for people taking advantage of you. And that trajectory sort of continues on, right? Because once you're in that, when you're caught in that web, it's very, very easy for folks to continue to victimize you, take advantage of you, of your vulnerability, because you have no other way to meet your basic needs.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that. But moving now on to Karen McHenry. Hi, Karen. Good evening.
Hi.
Thanks for being here. Karen has been at Belfair JCB for 35 years and has been instrumental in raising awareness and providing services to trafficked youth in Cuyahoga County. Now, let's just look back at the last 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know what the economic impact has been, thus folding into the homeless population. Tell us, how does that translate into youth trafficking specifically?
So thank you for this opportunity, because it's so important that youth are out there. Hopefully they'll hear this and know that we see them and we know that they need help. So with the pandemic, I mean, we think you look back at 2020, I mean, everybody was forced to be on the internet, right? So you were isolated, you were home, you were online. And so people took advantage of this. They knew this vulnerability was happening. And so one of the really alarming statistics was that 97.5% increase in online enticement. So that means that there were people on the internet enticing these kids during the pandemic, and they continue to do that. So this is what we're really worried about. And these different avenues that they're connecting with our kids are through gaming systems, chats, apps, messaging. So it's constant. So it's just very alarming to us. I mean, as of this morning, there's 197 kids missing in Cuyahoga County. So that is unfortunately a very typical number that isn't heightened due to the pandemic. And 113 of them are girls. So we know girls and boys are victims of sex trafficking. Belfair is wanting them to know that we're here to provide help and then get them to the different services, some of the people that are right here on this panel today, so that they can have a voice, they can be heard, and we can get them the complex, like Dr. Moore mentioned, there's so many layers to this, and there's so many basic needs, whether it's food, clothing, shelter. There are many things that we can support and do, help them get to those avenues so they can feel support and they can succeed. So we're just, with the pandemic, we're just very alarmed because we were all forced into the internet. And we know that people took advantage of this, and they saw that the vulnerability was there with these students, and many of them have been groomed and enticed. And we want the community and we want youth to know that Belfair is here to help, as well as so many of these other providers that are on this panel today.
Yeah, let's, whether we go back to what we knew as a normal life before when everybody was back in person, I think moving forward, regardless, we are just going to continue, or even more so, be dependent on the internet. So for parents who are watching, what do they need to know about things to look out for, especially considering there's a lot of, when working from home, the dynamic is crazy. Maybe parents don't realize that being on the iPad for school, or, venturing off somewhere else, some of these things can be harmless, or I'm sorry, not harmless, rather. There are certain things that seem like they could be harmless, that could be maybe a trap. So tell us what parents need to look out for.
So just being aware. So like what, first of all, if it's an extended period of time, like first, you should never have your computer or your phone being charged in your bedroom, when you're a minor or you're a child, because you're really just opening this window to letting people that don't have great intentions for your child, giving them access to your children. So, it might seem like it's just, oh, they're just playing video games. You have to be aware. Who are they playing the video games with? Do you know these people they're playing the video games with? Do you know their real names? So it's just really monitoring, having difficult conversations with your children about this. Have they been asked to send nudes? What are they messaging? What are they telling people? How are they getting their needs met? So many of these vulnerable youth have voids, and these people know how to get into their they're thinking, they manipulate them, they coerce them, and then they start giving out information. So really, it's having difficult conversations with your children about not sharing things, where they live, where they stay, and being mindful that, you know, there's a lot more to do than be on the internet, even if we're stuck home during a pandemic.
Thank you so much, Karen. And thank you to all of our panelists here today. We're all out of time. 30 minutes flies by, but certainly this is a conversation that will not stop here. We'll continue. We'll have information on our website, WKYC.com. You can also rewatch this forum on that website, WKYC.com, and also on YouTube. Don't forget to tune into WKYC all day long. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good evening.
Bye, everybody.
All right, that's it.
That's
Hey.
it. Great job.
Yeah, nice job. Anything else, anybody? All right, you have fun in New
Longer than
Orleans.
30 minutes.
Thanks.
Yeah, I gotta go finish this thing now. We're doing
Oh
this thing
yeah,
right
you be careful.
Oh yeah, right. Go save
Bye,
lives.
guys.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you